Andrew King.
Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
I'm doing good, man. How you doing?
Very well, very well.
Awesome. I was actually expecting you to be puffing on a cigar. I was hoping you would be because I definitely know you're an aficionado. What cigar are we smoking today?
This is a My Father Las Antillas.
Okay. Now,
Yeah, when I
this
just went to
what
an
is that
event the
supposed to
other
mean to
day.
me as someone who knows nothing about cigars? Could you tell me what that's supposed to mean?
Yeah, so it's My Father is the brand, and this is a sun-grown cigar. It's one of my favorites. I like the My Father the Judge too. There's many that I like. So
Very cool. And you
yeah,
went to a cigar show, you were saying.
yeah. I went to an event at a local cigar shop with a bunch of buddies, and the My Father rep was there, so they had all kinds of deals and stuff. So I stocked up on Friday night.
You seem
Yeah.
to do a lot of networking and a lot of things. I mean, I think maybe one of the best things I could do to start this interview would maybe be to have you describe who you are for people who may not know. I mean, a serial entrepreneur, a serial investor, an independent record label founder. How would you describe yourself, like in an elevator pitch, so to speak?
Yeah, so you kind of got it right there, right? It's like dichotomy of serial entrepreneur and serial failure, hence the book Failure Rules, the 5 rules of failure for entrepreneurs, creatives, and authentics, right? So it's the idea that taking, decisive action for not necessarily risky pursuits, but unorthodox pursuits, difficult pursuits, that those actions failures travel with them and you want to avoid them, but at the same time you need to premeditatively think about how you're going to confront them, metabolize them, and leverage and optimize them when they happen inevitably to kind of make you better, right? So that's essentially the premise and thesis of the book. So my background, right? So started out my early career mostly in the music industry. Worked for independent record labels like Relapse Records, which is an extreme metal grindcore label. Worked at Lumberjack Mortem Distribution for many years as a top salesman. Helped to do some of the initial retail campaigns to launch bands like All American Rejects, a lot of bands on the Trustkill and Ferret Records music labels, a lot of Bridge 9 Records artists, bands like Terror and American Nightmare. With Relapse Records, helped with the early Mastodon record, early Dillinger Escape Plan records, things like that, and started my own record labels throughout that time. So I was kind of getting a paid education in the music industry by day, and in the
Okay.
evening would work on my own record labels, Thorp Records, which has done bands like Madball, Slapshot, Blood for Blood, Ramallah, Sheer Terror, lots of kind of old metal and hardcore bands. And then Sailor's Grave Records, which was a later imprint I started in 2006, was more dedicated to street punk, oi, psychobilly,
Hmm.
those type of genres. So bands like US Bombs, which is fronted by the legendary skateboarder Dwayne Peters. Roger Moret, The Disasters. Roger Moret was the singer for Agnostic Front. The Business, which is an old British oi band. R.I.P. Mickey Fitz, the singer. That label then was birthed with a very, very different aesthetic later on. And over the years, I've released, over 120 recordings between the two labels. But at a certain point, failure did hit, right? And music industry art, commercializing art is very difficult, ups and downs. So at a certain point, I kind of pivoted from doing it full time, and it became a permanent kind of side hustle of a maintenance and management of IP rights versus a
Okay.
full-time endeavor. And I got into finance and banking and many other spaces, fitness, and opened up a gym. So kind of had a whole lot of kind of off-road entrepreneurial adventuring over the years.
Now, talk to me about sort of your understanding about the relationship of failure and success, I guess, when it comes to entrepreneurship, because it seems to me that so many people, when they want to start a business or they want to start, a podcast or a record label, whatever the case may be, they're thinking a lot about success. They're thinking about what they want to succeed, how they want it to go well. But a lot of people don't seem to be thinking about failure at the beginning. So when did you start thinking about failure in business? Was it after your first big failure?
Well, after maybe like the third or fourth,
Okay.
when I finally realized that I need to start factoring this more intentionally into my planning,
Took a
right?
while
So
to sink in.
yeah, I did. But, I was also conditioned by those where I got stronger. It was almost like Nassim Taleb, the author in his book Anti-Fragile, describes that, there are certain people that gain from harm, that they are not just kind of resilient where they get up off their feet and they get back at it, but they get up stronger, right? So it's the idea of like the hydra that multiplies and gains from harm. And so I think that's kind of how I became. And I almost became really fascinated with the idea of failure, right? So the book kind of the genesis of the book was after I went through a pretty difficult business divorce on one pursuit that kind of put my business life in disarray. I had to reorganize it, and there was some failure attached to that. And at the same time, my marriage, my first marriage, was falling apart. So I had this kind of like marital divorce on the personal level that was, another kind of failure unraveling. And I was taking a beach walk, and of course, I'm listening to punk rock. I'm listening to Motorhead, Ace of Spades, and Hard Times by the Cro-Mags. John Joseph, the singer of the Cro-Mags, who's a triathlete, author. He wrote the foreword to Failure Rules. And I'm listening to those songs. And I'm thinking about the famous Winston Churchill quote, "Success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm." For me, that was like the thread. Like that was like my endorphin, was the enthusiasm never stopped, right? And so I talk about this in the book where, as long as through your failures, you can find some element, some piece of enthusiasm and micro momentum to focus on, that can really carry you through the brutality of failures and help you continue to make gains. So, I write about in the book where there was a time where I was, again, going through this business divorce and marital divorce somewhat simultaneously in parallel. And all of a sudden I found myself, with no office to go to by day, no home to go to by night. I'm living out of a hotel room. And it was really during that empty space, that failure space, where I learned to leverage chaos as an idea engine and the enthusiasm of micro momentum. And in that time, like many things were born, right? So I ended up getting involved in the lead generation space, partnering with somebody, starting a proper lead generation company, which became lucrative. I also then started my banking career in the fintech space and in the payment space. I've been doing that 10 years now. I'm an executive banker now for an online fintech bank. My spy novel, I finished my first spy novel, released that. I kind of did some reinvestment in my record labels and released some good records. And I began this manuscript, Failure Rules, right? So it's like in that empty valley, in that failure space, if you're leveraging it correctly, you see chaos as an opportunity, you can find ways to stimulate that micro momentum and to find rebirth and regeneration.
That's fascinating. So would you say that, like, when you're in that point, let's say for you specifically in the hotel room, when you're, between jobs, essentially in between homes almost, were you looking for the positive in that moment, or was it a thing where you needed a couple of weeks to reflect and then start looking for the positive? Like, when would you recommend someone starts to look for those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there is the abrupt disruption emotionally, mentally, spiritually, when any true, real, purifying failure hits you. And that's failure rule number one, is failure purifies, right? And the idea is, the phoenix must burn to emerge. So you got to let that burn hit, right? And that burn is going to be painful, because failure only rules after it first fucking sucks, right? So it's going to suck first. And in that suck, you need to feel every ounce of that. And you got to let that pain kind of be that fire that then converts into the ambition to get out of it, right? To take the exhaust of failure and use that as that fuel. So yeah, you need some time where you feel the pain and you reflect and you process, but it has to convert into something positive. It has to convert into reinvention. I mean, there's a chapter in the book, reinvention, make reinvention your utmost skill. That's really the theme of it, you can't really do that sometimes until new thinking doesn't emerge until old thinking dies. New ways of being sometimes do not emerge until old ways of being die, right? And you have to allow that death to occur while simultaneously looking in that chaos, as an opportunity and finding what's the rebirth that's coming, and how you can quickly latch onto that, embrace that, and find momentum to make that into a tangible reality.
So how would you say that you process that with your marital divorce? Because that's obviously one that I think a lot of people go through, even if it's not an actual divorce, breakups, and that that could bring a lot of people down. So maybe talk about like what your internal dialogue at that time.
Yeah, that's a good question. So obviously that's very, very different for many people. Some people have very amicable divorces. Some people have very, very nasty divorces. I would say mine was probably somewhere in between, where I was pretty blindsided by it, and that was probably naivete on my part. I probably should have seen that one coming. But I think I was blind to some of my own insufficiencies and my own I wouldn't say negative, but deficient ways of being in a marital relationship. And so failure purified me in that sense too. I grew immensely during the period of being single after my married, in terms of personal development, the reading I did, the reflection I did, the changing of internal attitudes and changing of the way I kind of view relationships. And so while I did deal with lots of kind of pain and bitterness and kind of hangover feelings from the divorce, I think I quickly kind of grew into a better person, a better partner. And I had a relationship with one for many years after that, and then eventually have gotten remarried. And as much as divorce would obviously not be optimal, it happens a lot. And like any other failure, it can be something that can purify you and make you the better next version of yourself, if you're looking at it introspectively, if you're actually open to changing your ways of being and seeing where you might have been culpable in behavior that led to a dysfunction, that led to that disintegration.
So I mean, talking about that, in the themes in the book that you talked about, how did you decide which trials and tribulations to put in the book? Was it simply based on which ones taught you the most, or was it based on what you think would benefit other people to hear the most?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both. So, I mean, the book really kind of started out with me journaling and writing about the various failures that happened to me over the course of 2 decades and what I had learned from them and what they had kind of wrought in me. And I thought, okay, these are interesting. That's great. These are good stories. But as I did rewrites and redrafts, it became clear that, okay, there's lessons that are emerging from each one of these stories and each one of these chapters. And then those lessons seem to be bucketed up and bunched up and rolled up into 5 very specific overarching rules, which became the 5 rules of failure. So the structure is the book is there's 5 parts, each one pegged to a rule of failure. And then each chapter under each rule has its own anchor lesson at the top, and usually an anchor quote from somebody else. And then I layered in a variety of very diverse case studies to bring texture to the lessons and bring kind of some life to each rule. So I mean, it's everything from professional bowler Tom Smallwood to cupcake entrepreneur Gigi Butler to legendary boxer Jack Johnson, to Lemmy Kilmister from Motorhead, to Henry Rollins, to Rodney Dangerfield, to Stoic author Ryan Holiday. It's just a variety of really cool case studies layered in there.
Even
and
Andrew
I think
Yang.
that's what people are finding interesting. What's that?
Even Andrew Yang.
and Andrew Yang. That's right. Yes. So I think people are finding that interesting because it's not just like autobiographical, like that's an undercurrent, but I think the case studies even are more important throughout the book and the actual rules and the actual lessons, right? So I'm hoping that it is digested as being very reader facing and that they're getting something actionable out of it, whether or not they personally connect to my stories or not. It's more about the lessons and kind of making it more relatable by seeing, okay, who else has gone through these unorthodox paths or has been purified by failure? How did they handle it? How did they turn that into something magical, something unique, where they get succinctly hooked into their calling journey?
No, absolutely. I mean, it definitely, it takes from all different parts of these topics. It's not just based in one world. It's definitely, for all different readers and all different sort of mind states. So how about your time in the music world? Because you talk about coming up in different record labels, getting, your education, of course, starting your own record labels. I'm wondering, what did you draw that maybe you put into the book from that experience? Because I think it's clear to see like failure is a big part of the music business and especially bands.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the main things is realizing that first and foremost, creation is its own reward first. So you have to come at creative pursuits, even if they're entrepreneurial, where you're trying to monetize them. There's certain artistic entrepreneurial pursuits where the creation or the facilitating something to be put out into the world has to be its own reward first, right? And in order to do that, you need to think about how you're going to make money off of it if you can, but you also need to think about the reality that you might not. And what are the belts and suspenders? What is the scaffolding of support that you're building around your life where you're side hustling this to try to make it into something, into existence? What is your timeline of patience? What is your burn rate? How much are you willing to lose? What is the cost that you're willing to pay? Because there will be one. I mean,
financially and otherwise.
From 10 a.m. What's that?
Financially and otherwise, perhaps.
Yeah, and your time, right? Because if you're not viewing creation as its own reward, then you're going to feel like you're wasting your time. But if you're not making money on something, and say you're working on a book for 8 years before it even comes to life, once that creation is in existence, the reward is already there. Anything that happens after that is house money. You know, if there's any attention or adulation, or if it has impact, or if it makes money, if that's just the byproduct, then you've already won when you've created it. You know, and I think for my record labels, it was kind of like that for the first 4 years. I worked at night on it and didn't take a cent for 4 years, and then stumbled into some success after many, learning curves and failures. And I think it's that mentality. Like, you have to understand, that while something might become profitable and might become something that can be, an occupation or part of your work-life tapestry, if it's an artistic venture, you got to be in it for it first and figure out what that means for you and what your capacity is, in that, within those boundaries.
Would you say most people join it sort of with that backwards? Because at least from the outside looking in, it seems to be often the opposite for people.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, and I don't think those people, even if they succeed, there's kind of an air of inauthenticity to the work, potentially, or at least a susceptibility to that. And usually, I think those that succeed are sometimes surprised by their success because it wasn't what they were going after, and they don't even know how to handle it. Right.
That's true too.
I write in the book about Johnny Cash, and how he kind of rejected the pull to a normal 9-to-5 life by, rejecting the job as a salesman from his first father-in-law, the old, hello, I'm Johnny Cash, knocking on the door, being the salesman. Right. He rejected that and crashed into the tumultuous calling journey that was pulling him into music. And as fame grew, he could not handle it. He fell into addiction. He fell into, all kinds of behavior that wasn't, serving him or serving his family. And he went through the divorce, and he had all kinds of things that, kind of got its hooks in him. And it was that kind of paradox, right, where he probably wasn't looking for fame. It came about because he was doing something unique and authentic that he felt he had to do. And it was dangerous. It was a difficult, tumultuous path. And then at the same time, it was the tragedy wrought by his inability to process fame that also gave his music so much weight and so much beauty, particularly on the other side when he found kind of redemption. When he kind of went into more of his spiritual, act 2 of his career. And so, I think that it's a really tricky thing. Those that are looking to do anything other than put things out into the world for the sake of creation, with the hope of impact, if they're looking for something more, you got to be really careful. You got to make sure that that's subordinate to the purity of the authentic art.
That's so true. And it feels like as much as the inauthenticity comes from the people who are just in it for the money and success, it seems like that authenticity you're talking about is so infectious from people like Johnny Cash, or I think, somebody like Kurt Cobain would also be a perfect example.
100%.
What do you think it is about that? Like, why do you think that it's so infectious that this person didn't want to become famous, but they became famous? Why do we love something about that?
I don't know. I mean, it's kind of Americana in some ways. I mean, you think about George Washington; they wanted him to be king, and he didn't want to be king. He wanted to be president, right?
Right.
It's like those reluctant servants, those reluctant leaders are the ones we love the most. Nobody wants the haughty, over ambitious, kind of like in it for the show kind of artist or leader, right? We want the one who almost reluctantly does it because they feel they have to, and it's their calling and they're pulled to it.
Right.
And the attention is something they're almost uncomfortable with and grapple with. I think, that's what really makes it raw and unique and relatable and impactful. And at the same time, I think about I have this quote in the book from Ben Franklin, which is, hide not your talents, for use they were made. What's a sundial in the shade? So on the other end of that, if you do have some talent, if you do have something to say or something to create, even if you're uncomfortable with kind of being out in the public eye or putting it out into the world or doing promotion, you got to find a way to do that. I think of Stephen Pressfield, the author of The War of Art, who I love, and I write about Stephen Pressfield's story in the book, how he would work a job for 4 years, save up money, and then burn his savings to go write a book. And at one point, he was homeless and selling books out of the trunk of his car and living in his car. And he talks about he now does social media and he does the things that authors need to do to put themselves out in the world, but he's very uncomfortable with that. But you still have to find a way to do that. You still have to find a way to embrace that Ben Franklin quote. And it's that tug, it's that tension between those two sensibilities.
Of course. And that fight with resistance, right? I mean, speaking of Pressfield, has that been something that you've encountered, maybe even when combating failures or even in general, like that resistance of what you should really be doing?
Honestly, I don't have that much. Writing comes very easy to me. I feel like I could access the muse pretty easily. I'm a night owl. I'm not like Ryan Holiday, who says, win the morning, win the day. I'm the opposite. Right. Shut the lights out, let the world go to sleep, pour me a bourbon, light me up a cigar, man, and my imagination goes wild. I'll be up. We're rolling. And I'm going to get shit done. I'm just very different that way. Like, I am a night owl. And when I slipstream into that space, I got no problem with the writing and resistance there. I probably have a little more resistance on the mechanisms of mobilizing out. Like, I'm still learning the whole world of social media and the whole world of how to promote the book. I have a lot of good help, in terms of a publicist, and Srinivas Rao is a great author of The Art of Being Unmistakable, which was a book that inspired me to write this book. It was a Wall Street Journal bestseller, I believe. And he also wrote the book Only is Better Than Best. And he actually now is helping me. I've kind of hired him to help coach me on how to navigate the book world, right? So I got some people around me, but it's all very new to me. So there's probably more resistance to me on some of the growing pains of learning the mechanisms of, quote unquote, building a brand and building an audience and building a readership. I mean, that's just an open space that I'm just learning how to navigate. But typical resistance, I don't get it that much, man. Mm-hmm. If something's in me, man, I'm going to get it out. And there's always something in the basement, That's the thing that I sort of find curious about the whole concept of resistance, is that, like, some people don't seem to feel it at all, and others, it seems to really get them. But, you got to push it out. So how about, the influences in the book? Obviously we mentioned a lot of them. Who would you say, from Winston Churchill to, people like The Rock, was the most, the one that made the biggest impression on you? So I just mentioned Srinivas Rao. That book was very impactful on mobilizing some of the early writings. Also, James Altucher, who wrote Choose Yourself. Do you know who James Altucher is? I've heard of the book. I haven't read it, though. Yeah. So he also has a great podcast, and he's, investor, master chess player. He was even a comedian for a while and owned a comedy club in New York for a bit. He's written a ton of books. And his book, Choose Yourself, was just so vulnerable and so just open about his failures. And just that rawness, that style really helped kind of like give me an open door to like, yeah, you know what? Like Hemingway said, we the world breaks all of us, and many of us become stronger at the broken place. Those it does not break, it kills.
Oh,
And
damn.
I let my failures and break me, but not kill me. And for me, the best way to get stronger those broken places was to talk about them with vulnerability and openness. And that's what I did in the book. And I think I learned that from Altucher. Right? He was
Hmm.
really a heavy influence on me. In fact, I use a quote from him kind of as the anchor quote for failure rule number 2, which is nothing is safe. Just about the volatility of of life, of the world, of trying to make your way as an entrepreneur or creative. You have to understand that first and foremost, nothing is safe, and then you go forth anyway, and you try to mine some good out of your skills and put that into the world.
Through the danger, right? Wow. I
Yeah.
mean, so thinking about, you mentioned the space of creating an audience and being out here on social media. I wonder, coming from a label perspective, especially an independent label perspective, how do you think, like, how would you assess the game today in terms of promoting music and getting it out there compared to what it was when you first came up in it?
Yeah. So, I mean, it was very gatekeeper dependent when I first came up on them. And it was still CDs, digital wasn't a thing. It was all reliant on the piping of the retail landscape. And it was about pay to play to get your stuff on the shelf. And to get those orders in from Best Buy and get on the end cap and get the listening stations. And I cut my teeth for years and years, working on those type of programs and launching, physical retail programs. It was so cost heavy. I mean, from the shipping,
Yeah.
from the returns and the attendant return fees. So not only do you not sell your record, you get paid for it. And then they take the money back because they returned it because only maybe half sold on the shelf. But then there's also a fee per unit for them having to return it. I mean, it's
Damn.
just a really horrible, difficult model to work with and predict as a record label. And then the switch from digital was great, but it also was very tumultuous because then all of a sudden people are buying digital, but you already shipped all this product out in the market, and then more gets returned because it's going to digital. And so it was a very difficult shift. But I think that's creative destruction. That's how we progress. You have to deal with that creative destruction. And in the end, I'm much happier owning the IP rights for digital, where you own the rights for stuff on a server. You're not shipping anything. You don't have the returns to worry about. There's a longer tail to recoup on a project, though, because you're not getting paid up front for one big shipment, right? You're getting it
Right.
over time, particularly with streaming. Over the long haul, I think streaming is, it's more lucrative than downloads or anything else. I think streaming has an exponentiality to it over
Okay.
the long tail, which is very advantageous. But for artists, I think it's beneficial for them. They don't have those gatekeepers. You think of the SoundCloud rappers, right? Lil Peep and all of them, the way that they were
Exactly.
able to break out into the world through SoundCloud rap. And that's just amazing. They got through the gatekeepers and they created their own genre using the word SoundCloud, the mechanism for them to get it out in the world,
Exactly.
and I think that's really amazing. But there's still a space for labels, at certain levels. Bands need more financing for marketing or what have you. They need that support, even at a smaller level. Like for my one label, Sailor's Grave Records, we kind of have a niche. We know what space we play in terms of bands that have X amount of sales, and that they need an extra amount of money, to record, or they need some branding to be associated with other bands to kind of help them in getting tours and networking. And so there's still a cohesiveness within a label that's valuable, but it is a lot less. It is a lot less. Labels mean a lot less than they used to. So I think it's definitely changed and in favor of the artists, and good for them.
What are your thoughts when you hear artists, I think recently the biggest one was Taylor Swift talking about streaming prices, how she doesn't feel artists are getting paid out enough, how it's like pennies on the dollar, this and that. I mean, do you feel like the streaming royalties are fair for artists? And like, how do you, assess that situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I can't even tackle that one with any sort of efficacy, right? Because I think there's so many layers. It depends on the artist.
Mhm.
And I think it's even going into the book world now, right? Like, you're not necessarily making your money off the primary product that you created. Sometimes it's the ancillary things where you're really making money. I mean, for an artist, they're going to have to look at publishing. They're going to have to look at merchandising, look at touring. For an author, you're going to have to look at, are you going to create online courses? Do you have merchandise associated with your book?
Yeah.
Are you making money off YouTube monetization for talking about your book? You can't always look at the primary art as the highest monetary mechanism. And I think that's kind of the struggle there. Like, yeah, streaming's not going to pay as much, but if streaming gets you the attention, it gets you the fan base that you can leverage for other ancillary products that might have higher margin. You got to focus on that. It's just the reality of the market.
That's a good point. So do you think that there will ever be a change in the percentages of streaming, or do you think that a company like a Spotify or Apple Music, if people are using the service and artists are putting their music on with the current rates, maybe it could be argued, why would they be motivated to change it?
I think that's probably the case.
Yeah.
I mean, it's geared towards the market, and the consumer wants to pay a subscription fee, and that can only be sliced up so much to distribute the artist. At the same token, how many more artists now are being discovered because of the accessibility through streaming, where somebody doesn't have to take a risk to buy a whole album, a physical album, where they might only end up liking one song, and they can try things out risk-free. They can listen to anything risk-free. And how many bands are discovered because of that accessibility? I still think it's all very net positive.
No doubt. So, I mean, how about the impacts of the business that you've noticed since the pandemic? One of the things that we saw recently, Tobias Forge from Ghost came out and he said that there's too many shows going on and it's hurting everybody because we have the rebook shows from 2020 and the current shows, right? What do you think of that?
Well, there definitely is there's this pent up hunger from artists to go out and play. So one of the bands that I put out an EP 4 years ago, one of my favorite bands, Madball, they did a show in Tompkins Park. I think that was 2021. It was very controversial because it was still COVID. Nobody's wearing masks and this and that. But it was just pent up energy. And it was them and Wisdom in Chains and I think Blood Clot played, which is John Joseph and Cro-Mag's other band. And it was you could just see bands were not going to be cooped up anymore, right?
Right.
Regardless of controversy, this or that. And I think then on the other end, where now touring has become normalized again, it's I do think there's a bit of an over engagement that might saturate a bit, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's probably something in play here, where it'll then normalize and kind of go back to the more reasonable rhythm where it's not oversaturating. But look, I mean, if I was in a band for years and years and years, and that's where I got my energy, and that's where I got my meaning in life, and my fans loved it, and I'd be itching to go play as much as possible after a 2-year holdup.
Yeah, no question, man. So I mean, this show, so this was this staged by the bands, they just went in Central Park and they just started playing, or what was that about?
Not Central Park, Tompkins Park.
Tompkins Park.
I mean, they had Black and Blue Productions, I think, is who organized it. I don't know all the ins and outs, but yeah, they got whatever permits they need and this and that, but it was still very controversial because it was clearly like a rebellious act against the lockdowns in many ways. And the show was packed. And it was apolitical. I mean, it wasn't a political thing necessarily either, really. But, rock and roll is rebellion, and it's rebellion, many forms, right? So.
And everything also became political too at that time. So it's even if somebody wasn't trying to politicize something, people sort of made it that way. So I could see that.
That's exactly what happened, But I didn't actually go to that show. But just from watching the videos of it, I wish I did. I was actually there the next day to go to John Joseph, who sings for the Cro-Mags and Blood Clot. He does these walking tours in New York. They're called Fear City walking tours, and he gives a tour from the lens of the depravity of the Lower East Side back in the day, and and all the punk rock history of the streets, and it was a really amazing tour. It's a 4-hour walking tour, no bathroom breaks, no nothing. He's narrating the whole time. It was awesome.
Just going for it. That's so cool. Yeah. Now, Andrew, the last thing I really wanted to ask you was, for entrepreneurs, for people who are maybe they want to get their start in some sort of entrepreneurship, but they don't know where to start or how to embrace their failures, what would be some advice that you'd want to give to them?
Yeah, so I think I would go to failure rule number 4, which is build your thing one and thing two dependency. And then parentheses, it's failure prevention strategy, right? So it's the idea, and I wish I embraced this more early on of, know that nothing is safe, which is failure rule number 2. Still go forth anyway with your dream and pursue it, even though your dreams are not safe.
Right.
But try to build reasonable undergirding and scaffolding to enable your dream. So your thing one is your enabler pursuit, which will stabilize you as much as possible, so you can more experiment with the adventure of chasing your thing two North Star pursuit, which is your highest conception of meaning. And one enables the other, right? So I think of so an example that I write in the book would be Bridge 9 Records. All his early releases were underwritten by an enabler pursuit where he started a merchandise company called Yankees Suck. And he would go to Red Sox game and sell T-shirts and bumper stickers say Yankees Suck. And one could argue that's putting good money after bad, but he would take the profits from that and underwrite his early releases, right? And so that's kind of an example of that thing one, thing two dependency. So you have to think of very circumventing, creative, almost complex ways of bringing your dreams into reality, because you can't just go straight at it, right? You can't just quit your job and go, I'm just going for it, and just, think that it's going to always work out. Or you do something like Stephen Pressfield example. He saved up money for 4 years and burnt the money to write a book, but he was prepared to go back to work if he had to. Like, you have to interact with the realities of the real world. You often have to simultaneously work a low meaning job in order to, mobilize your high meaning, entrepreneurial or artistic pursuit.
100%. Well, I greatly value the information that you've shared with us here today. Andy Thorp King, the book is called Failure Rules, the 5 Rules of Failure for Entrepreneurs, Creatives, and Authentics. And there it is right there. Thank you so much for taking the time today. It's been an absolute pleasure, my man.
Yep. And you guys can find links to the book, the soundtrack that we have for the book, YouTube channel, merchandise, Soul on Fire merchandise, everything at andrewthorpeking.com. No E on the end of Thorpe.